Dagmar wanted to stay to the last possible moment, so as to be near me. In the evening of the 17th of July we all sat together again over a bottle of champagne. On the 18th of July, I set off while it was still dark, in order to reach my command post before dawn, before the Spitfires and Hurricanes arrived. The journey took longer than expected, because of the nightly supply traffic. It was not until just before 9 that I was on the hills east of my combat sector. Only a few kilometers now separated me from my command post. I stopped and we searched the sky for fighters. It was very hazy over the area of operations. Everything seemed to be in order. Shortly after 9, I arrived at my command post and was looking forward to a Normandy breakfast, after which I intended changing from my uniform of the day into combat attire. The commander of 2 Battalion greeted me briefly. I sensed that something was not right, for all the men at the command post. Then came the report that almost took my breath away. Since 5 o'clock this morning the British have been bombing our sector, especially the area of 2 Battalion, endlessly with thousands of bombers. This bombing was followed by a creeping barrage from the artillery. The firing stopped barely half an hour ago. Seemed nervous. How are things with your 2 Battalion? Have you any news? Was my first question. Not yet, we have no radio contact, came the answer. How about the Tigers and the Panzer Battalion of our regiment? Answer, no radio contact. I don't know how things look there. And 2 Battalion. Major Becker's assault guns. Have you told division? My questions became more and more pressing, but it was clear that nothing had been done. This was of course the renewed attempt at a breakout. Yet nothing at all, had been done. My deputy appeared to be in shock. He seemed absolutely helpless. I ordered him to be at my disposal. After a few days I instructed my adjutant to go in person to army personnel and demand that the commander be relieved. This was granted at once. I had become the richer by experience. I had witnessed anew how officers and NCOs, who in peacetime had been outstanding instructors, popular with their superiors and comrades, lost their nerve in an emergency and were unable to cope with reality. General Pip Roberts, as he told me later, had undergone the same experience. For the same reasons as mine with the battalion commander, he had been forced to have the commanders of a brigade and a regiment relieved. The experience had shown, moreover, that the relief had to be made at once, if the unit was not to be affected and demoralized. So there I was at my command post. No one knew what had happened, although it was obvious that the enemy was mounting a decisive attack. I dismissed all thought of a good breakfast and my combat clothes. I ran to a radio Panzer IV that the Panzer regiment had put at my disposal, offered the driver a cigarette and said, "Let's go. Take the main road to Caen." To my adjutant I shouted, "I will call you as we go along. Make contact with division at once, even if you have to go there in person. Tell them what's happened and ask for reserves so that we can stop the British. Send an officer to the tanks." Slowly and without interference I approached the village of Cagny, which lay exactly in the middle of my sector and was not occupied by us. The eastern part as far as the church was undamaged, the western part had been flattened. When I came to the western edge of the village, I saw to my dismay about 25 to 30 British tanks, which had already passed southward over the main road to Caen, which ran from east to west. A glance then to the north, to where my I battalion ought to be, or had been, in combat positions. The whole area was dotted with British tanks, which were slowly rolling south, against no opposition. My God, I thought. The bombing and artillery barrage destroyed the battalion. It was quite clear, the British, with a bombing of unprecedented extent, were trying to break through our positions on the narrowest of fronts. How could I plug this gap? Perhaps with an attack by the superior Tiger Mark Vis. So, back to the command post, to try to organize countermeasures. As I was driving past the church of Cagny, which lay in the undamaged part of the village, I saw to my surprise a Luftwaffe battery with its 4 8.8C in anti-aircraft guns, all pointing to the sky. What are they doing here? Went through my mind. I did not see them on my way here. Under a tree I called a halt, bailed out, and ran to the battery. A young captain came up to me. "Major," he said, "can you tell me what's going on here?" "My God, what are you doing here? Have you any idea what's happening over there to the left of you?" He answered calmly, "I belong to an air defense ring to protect the factories and city of Caen against air raids. At the moment I am waiting for the next raid." "Man," I replied as calmly as I could, You have already been bypassed by enemy tanks. North of here it's absolutely swarming with tanks. You will move into position at once with your 4 guns on the northern edge of Cagny and attack the advancing tanks. Don't worry about tanks that are already going south. Hit the enemy from the flank. In that way you will force the advance to a halt. His reply came just as calmly, Major, my concern is enemy planes. Fighting tanks is your job. I am Luftwaffe. He was about to turn away. At that I went up to him, drew my pistol which we had to carry for trips to Paris, leveled it at him and said, either you were a dead man or you can earn yourself a medal. The young captain realized that I was in earnest. I bowed to force. What must I do? I took him by the hand and under cover of the hedges and trees ran with him to the northern edge of the village. Here, place your 4 guns in this apple orchard. The corn over there is so high that you will be well protected and just have a field of fire across it. Shoot every tank you see. I will see if I can send you a platoon of grenadier to guard you against surprise attacks. Should the situation become critical for you, destroy your guns and withdraw to the south. I hope our Tiger Battalion will soon be able to mount a counterattack from the right flank. With them in with you we should be able to beat back the enemy attack. Especially as it's not accompanied by infantry as far as I can tell. Listen, I will be back in half an hour. All clear. He still seemed to be undecided, but finally nodded. Okay, Major. Back at my command post I realized the full extent of the preparatory carpet bombing. My orderly officer reported that the Tiger Battalion had been thoroughly saturated by the heaviest American bombers. He himself had seen some of the 62-ton colossi upside down. Craters 30 feet across had made the whole terrain almost impassable. There could be no question of using the Tigers in the next few hours. The fate of the Panzer IV Battalion had been much the same. My command post had made Major Becker, who was now at contact with his batteries. 1 battery has been completely knocked out by bombs, he reported. 2 batteries on the left flank are intact and will support the Grenadier of 2 Battalion, who have gone into action against the British infantry. The other 2 batteries will be going into action at any minute on the right flank, where Major Kurz, without first waiting for orders, has set up a defensive front with his 2 battalion. Captain Liebskind, my adjutant, came back from division. To stop the gap on my left flank there were no reserves, was the message from Feuchtinger. However, I was to be sent the reconnaissance battalion to secure my weak right flank. Captain Brandt would be reporting to me. My orders were, to prevent without fail any attempt by the enemy to break through to the east on the open right flank. Captain Brandt reported that same morning. Major, I am again under your command. Lying with the reconnaissance battalion about 7 kilometers east of Troarn. Since the 6th of July we have been lying in reserve south of Caen and have to some extent been replenished with men and materiel. We could see the terrible air attacks early this morning. Has your combat group been badly hit? I put Brandt briefly in the picture. On my left wing there is a yawning gap to Caen and Regiment 192, which I can't fill. But 3 anti-tank sections with 8.8 cm cannons are in place on the hills of Bourguibus. They should in fact be able to stop any tank advance, so long as the British don't employ infantry. But there is also a very dangerous gap between my command post here and Major Kerr's 11 Battalion. If the British were to push through it, the way to the southeast would be open to them. This gap is where I am putting you. Keep contact on your right with Kerr's and on your left with me. One of Major Becker's batteries with their 7.5 cm anti-tank guns long will be under your orders to combat enemy tanks. Send a liaison officer to me here. Good luck to you, Brandt. We have got to survive the day. From official reports, messages from my units, and the statements of prisoners, a gloomy picture of the situation emerged. Accounts that I have been able to see since the war have confirmed the situation at the time. Montgomery had decided to launch a general attack out of the Little Bridgehead and thrust into the French hinterland in the direction of Fayez. The Guards Armored Division and the 7th Armored Division, well known to me from North Africa, to protect each flank, 1 Canadian Infantry Division on the right and 1 British Infantry Division on the left, over 1,000 guns of every caliber, plus naval artillery. The 6th Airborne Division and the 51st Highland Division, who were to remain in the bridgehead to protect it, to prepare the attack. The biggest aerial armada so far assembled in the war, made up of about 2,500 British and American bombers. Over a width of about 4 kilometers and a depth of about 7. The strips of attack were to be so saturated that virtually no one would be able to survive the bombardment. The air attack was to be followed by a creeping barrage from the 1,000 guns, plus the naval artillery, behind which the first waves of tanks were to advance in quick succession. The initial goal, the hills at Bourguibus, about 15 kilometers from the starting line. No one will survive this inferno. We need only march in with our tanks to open the way to Paris. That was the unanimous opinion of the Allies engaged in the attack. How very wrong we were was soon to appear, was what I heard after the war from many commanders in the British Tank Corps. Since all the units had to squeeze through cleared passages in the minefields, one division followed the other, to advance after the breakout on a wide front toward the hilly terrain near Bourguibus. My one hope was that the 8.8 cm battery at Cagny and the two 7.5 cm assault gun companies would delay the enemy long enough for reserves to be brought up. These were the LSTSS Panzer Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division of Hitlerjugend. Both had recently been taken out of the front to be restored to strength in the Falaise and Lisieux area, where they now were. Late in the morning of the 18th of July, reports came in from two of Becker's batteries, which were in action with I Battalion on the left flank. Individual companies of I Battalion have taken up the fight against the following infantry. We gave support as far as possible. A second wave of British tanks had turned west after the disaster at Cagny and was advancing toward the Bourguibus hills. We gradually had to disengage, therefore, to avoid being encircled. Major Becker was at my command post. I called him over. "Listen, Becker, I need your batteries more urgently than ever, since for the moment the two panzer battalions are out of action owing to the bombardment. All the batteries, especially those isolated on the left flank, must operate on their own responsibility, cover the grenadier for as long as possible and above all attack the advancing British tanks from the flank. We must bring the tank thrust to a halt." Major Bill Close, British, who led one of the tank companies of the regiment in the IITH Armored Division that had veered west, today a good friend of mine. As he was to tell me later, we had warned the Guards Armored Division coining after us about Cagny. In spite of that they pushed on and within seconds lost about 20 tanks at Cagny. We could see how the front regiment tried to avoid the fire from Cagny. In so doing several tanks were again knocked out, this time from woodland in the east. The attack came to a standstill. We were glad we had been able to turn off to the west and so escape the fire of your damned 88s. We pushed forward to the south across the Paris-Caen road. We saw fire burning here and there in Caen, lying on our right, and in front of us, about 5 kilometers to the south, the Bourguibus Hills, our first objective, which we should have reached early that morning. Unhindered we moved forward in wide formation, my company in the lead. Suddenly, when we had got to about 1,000 meters from the villages on the hills, we came under concentrated fire from 88s. Within seconds about 15 of our tanks were stationary and on fire. All attempts to turn aside to left or right failed. By late afternoon I had only a few tanks left that were still intact. The other company fared no better. We had to break off our advance and withdraw. Shortly after came the order from brigade to suspend hostilities for the day. New orders followed next day. After the arrival of the reconnaissance battalion I felt I had stabilized my right flank to some extent. I had still not had time to change, let alone have something to eat. For the next few hours everything hung on the flak battery at Cagny. I got into my tank again and rolled cautiously into the village. By the church I stopped the tank and ran to the 4 guns, where an almost indescribable sight met my eyes. The 8.8 cm cannons were firing one salvo after the other. One could see the shots flying through the corn like torpedoes. The men on the guns were proud of their first engagement as an anti-tank unit. All 4 guns were intact and had not been attacked. In the extensive cornfields to the north of the village stood at least 40 British tanks, on fire or shot up. I saw how the tanks that had already crossed the main road were slowly rolling back. Becker's assault guns had also joined in the battle. From the right flank they shot up any tank that tried to bypass the village. The young captain came up to me. I congratulated him. "A platoon from my staff company will be here in a few minutes to protect you from surprise attacks. I repeat my orders of this morning, you will hold your position for as long as you can and oppose the enemy tank attack. As soon as the situation becomes critical, destroy your guns and retreat with the grenadier to my command post." With that I left this battery, which had played such a decisive part on that the 18th of July. Back at my command post I made contact with Feuchtinger. I described the situation as it appeared to me at about midday on the 18th of July, and ended. General, I believe that the whole British attack has come to a standstill, thanks to the engagement of all elements of my combat group, and thanks not least to a Luftwaffe 8.8 cm battery that I found by chance at Cagny and put to use in the ground fighting. I see a great danger, however, on my right wing. If the British were to move up their infantry, things would look pretty bad for my rather thin defensive front. For the moment it's all right still, but reserves ought to arrive in the course of the afternoon. Congratulations. Luck on this successful defense. I can give you good news. The 1st SS Panzer Division has orders to move up to us at once from Falaise and strengthen our defense, especially on the Bourguibus Hills. The 12th SS Panzer Division also has orders to support us on our right, hence your flank, and prevent a breakthrough to the southeast. The 1st SS will arrive today in the late afternoon, the 12th SS not before midday tomorrow. We must hold till then. In the late afternoon Feuchtinger came through again. The first elements of the 1st SS have arrived. Together with them we have knocked out a lot of tanks. With your tally the British have probably lost at least 200 tanks. I am reassured that you can hold out on the right flank. Convey my appreciation to Kerr's commander of 2 Battalion. In the afternoon I finally changed and at once felt better. The Tiger Battalion sent word that about 10 Tigers were again operational, and that they would be mounting an attack on the enemy's left flank. Lieutenant as he then was Freiherr von Rosen, commander of a Panzer VI Tiger Company, has given the following account. The bombardment early in the morning of the 18th of July was the worst we had ever experienced in the war. Although we were in foxholes under our tanks, we had a lot of casualties. Some of the 62-ton machines lay upside down in bomb craters 30 feet across. They had been spun through the air like playing cards. 2 of my men committed suicide. They were not up to the psychological effect. Of my 14 Tigers not one was operational. All had been covered in dust and earth. The guns disadjusted, the cooling systems of the engines out of action. Yet by early afternoon a few of my Tigers were ready for battle. I was to use them to attack westward in the flank of the British tank attack. From captured maps and operational plans we knew that the Guards were supposed to attack in a southeasterly direction, the 7th Armored Division in the center southward, and the leading 8th Armored Division to the southwest. While the Guards, it was their very first engagement, felt their way forward cautiously and were beaten back time and again with heavy losses in tanks. The 7th Armored Division had not as yet put in an appearance. It was not until the late afternoon of the 18th of July that it was able to pass through the small number of gaps in the minefield. The British offensive, for the 18th of July, had come to a halt. The gain in territory was not as yet very great. Of a breakout or a breakthrough there could be no question. We were certain, however, that the British would be preparing themselves for the next day. The question remained whether, with our depleted forces, we would again be able to stop the attack. The morning of the 19th of July remained surprisingly quiet. In the course of individual tank thrusts a number of British tanks were again knocked out. But then, in the early afternoon, Monty took the field with all 3 tank divisions, supported by infantry and artillery, which had been brought up in the meantime. While the Guards Division operated very cautiously for lack of experience, we discovered to our surprise that the 7th Armored Division was doing the same. It was going through the same experience that we had been through. It was experienced and for that reason operated with extreme caution. We managed to fight off all attacks on the right wing and in so doing inflicted heavy losses on the 2 British divisions. For that we had to thank the skillful engagement of my 11 Battalion under Major Kerrs, as well as the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion and Beeker's assault guns. A liaison officer came to me from the Reconnaissance Battalion. Major, I have to report that by our own counterattacks we have forced the enemy to retreat again and again. For a while there was a British field dressing station behind our lines. An hour ago a British tank appeared with a white flag and brought back some of our wounded. We thanked them at once. That was true fairness. From division and from Becker's 2 batteries now operating alone on my left flank we heard that the 11th Armored Division, with grenadier and supported by tanks and heavy artillery, had mounted an attack about 4 o'clock against 2 villages on the northern edge of the Bourguibus Hills, which were defended by elements of the 1st Panzer Division. Shortly after came the following report from one of the assault gun batteries. Both villages have been taken by the enemy. but further attack halted. Our two batteries have arrived fighting sometimes parallel to the British without loss on the hills. Now things became critical, but the British attack was not continued and again came to a halt. It was astonishing that the attack in my sector should be so hesitant. The shock from our 8.8 cm anti-tank guns, the few Tigers, and Becker's assault guns seemed to have struck deep among the British. With only about 400 grenadier left, we had to hold the long front in the east. That was too few to withstand a vigorous attack. Finally, about 5 o'clock, the first elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division arrived. A general staff officer made contact with me. The division has been through a costly march. We were shot up time and again by British fighters and forced into cover. The bulk of the division will be here in the course of the night. How do things look with you? I put him in the picture and learned that my combat group was to be relieved by this division. Shortly after came the order from my own division. In the course of the night, von Luck's combat group will disengage from the enemy and hand over to the 12th SS Division. You will take up a defensive position on either side of Troarn on the east bank of the flooded dives. Rock's combat group will also be relieved and stationed east of the dives. The relief went through without difficulty. I hope to be able to give the thoroughly overtired and battle-weary men a little rest. By the late evening of the 19th of July it was possible to see what the British had managed or failed to do. The little bridgehead had been extended by about 9 kilometers. Caen had now been fully occupied. But the breakthrough in the direction of Falaise had not been made. Monty was to maintain later that more was not supposed to have been achieved. That Operation Goodwood had had as its objective the tying down of as many German panzer divisions as possible to make it easier for the Americans to break out as planned further west. Others besides me have had doubts about this version of events, and for the following reasons. Captured Canadians told us that shortly before the attack Monty had called out to them. To Falaise, "Boys, we were going to march on Paris." Anyone who knew Monty and his ambition, and had analyzed his operations in North Africa, would have taken it for granted that he would not have been content with a mere tying down of German panzer divisions and an extension of the bridgehead. Be that as it may, Operation Goodwood cost the British about 450 tanks. It was a masterpiece of preparation and logistics. And yet we were able to prevent the enemy from making a breakthrough. Only now did we hear that on the day before Operation Goodwood, the start of the offensive, own Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been severely wounded in a fighter-bomber attack on his individual car. We could hardly take it in. To us Rommel had always seemed invulnerable. Nevertheless, the deep defensive front set up by Rommel had held against Montgomery's attack. As late as 15 and the 17th of July he had checked this defense in the area of our corps. It is probably true to say that with this Rommel had denied his constant adversary the way to Paris, his last military success. During the night of 19–20th of July, torrents of rain set in, which made our relief more difficult. I shall never forget on our night march to the north the stink of the dead cows, lying in the fields. On the 20th of July, moreover, there was a further heavy thunderstorm, which turned the battlefield into a swamp. The British Air Force had to stay on the ground. Late in the evening of the 20th of July we learned First Street through leaflets dropped by the British. Then also from our own radio station the attempt on Hitler's life. The older ones among us had mixed feelings, the younger were angry. It's a stab in the back to us here at the front. My own thoughts went back inevitably to my talks with Rommel in North Africa in 1943 and in France in 1944. An attempt on Hitler's life would create a stab in the back legend. As soon as a second front has been established and the end is in sight, we must force him to abdicate, to avoid further losses and to concentrate on the war in the cast. Next day a war correspondent appeared at my command post. "Major, what do you say here at the front about the assassination attempt on the Führer?" My answer was prompt. "Listen, we have been engaged in heavy defensive fighting here for weeks. We have not had time to give it a thought. Come back when the situation has calmed down a bit." An offhand, risky answer, but what was the use? Worth noting is a piece of information that came to me only recently, from a reliable source. When our corps commander, Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, of Army Group B, was told of the attempt on Hitler's life, his first question was, who was it, the SS or the Army? Although the RAF launched endless attacks and the Guards Division, with strong patrols, tried to find a gap to the east, the days that followed seemed to us almost like a holiday. Owing to the heavy downpours of rain, the flooded river dives had become even more impassable. For me, the important thing was to recreate I Battalion, which had been almost wiped out by the bombing on the 18th of July. At the division's field replacement section, a new battalion, built up from remaining cadres and well-trained replacements from home, with factory-fresh SPWS armored personnel carriers, was brought to operational level in only a few days. We marveled at the logistics by which, time and again, replacements, ammunition, and vehicles were brought up to the front. After only a week in our defensive resting position, the division was pulled out, to be restored to strength. We all hoped for a few days' peace to lick our wounds. But signs of the next British offensive, which they called Bluecoat, began to appear and put an end to the respite. After only 2 days, the division was transferred to the area south of Villers-Bocage on the important road No. 175 south of Bayeux. Together with the brave 21st Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, we managed to hold the front. The men were tired, our body heavy. We had been in action now for 8 weeks without a break, longer, therefore, than any other division. But in spite of that, morale was high. The men fought until they dropped. Then, however, on the 25th of July, after a 4-hour aerial bombardment, the Americans managed to break through at the Panzer Lehr Division. We pulled back our front a little and now held a line from Avranches Street, LB to south of Caen. Then, on the 31st of July, came news that General George S. Patton, probably the most flexible of the Allied tank commanders, had broken through at Avranches near the famous Mont Street. Michel, with that the way to the French interior, to Paris and Reich territory, seemed to be open. Hitler reacted at once. He threw General Eberbach on Avranches with a hastily assembled panzer group, in order to cut Patton's lines of communication. Once again it was the people at Bletchley Park, who were cracking our codes, and the U.S. Air Force that nipped our attack in the bud. Worse still, however, was the fact that all our divisions engaged in the West were now threatened with encirclement, since Patton would obviously be able to continue his eastward thrust unchecked. Then everything happened very quickly. We had to fall back, for our decimated, exhausted divisions would not have been able to withstand another big push. It took a further 2-week delaying actions and continual evading movements to the southeast before we reached the area of Falaise, south of Caen. With that, the whole Cotentin Peninsula, with its important harbor of Cherbourg, was finally lost. Montgomery, meanwhile, had also emerged from the bridgehead enlarged by Operation Goodwood, and with the 4th Canadian Division and a Polish tank division was pressing forward into the area northeast of Falaise. Monty's attack from the northwest and Patton's thrust from the southwest threatened to envelop almost the whole of the German Normandy front in one vast pocket. On the 17th of August, both the Canadian Division and the Polish Tank Division pushed through and split our division in two. Rock's Combat Group, with Regiment 192, Reconnaissance Battalion 21, and the last 8 tanks, fell into the pocket that was forming. My combat group and divisional HQ remained just outside. From now on, Allied bombers swooped down without a break on our retreating divisions. The excellent American artillery covered all roads and routes with heavy fire day and night. Worse off were the infantry divisions, which, with their horse-drawn units, struggled east on foot and blocked all the roads. Appalling scenes took place. The tanks, armored elements, and motorized supply units ruthlessly forced their way through to the east. On and beside every road and track leading east, shot-up vehicles had broken down. The cadavers of horses lay around. Even ambulances, packed with wounded, stood burning by the side of the road. Valiant officers tried to bring a little order into the chaos, but usually without success. With my combat group, I received orders to set up a defensive block fronting to the west, to prevent any further advance by the Polish and Canadian divisions. From the heights west of Vimoutiers, where Rommel had been severely wounded on the 17th of July, I had a wide view into the Great Valley. There, enemy planes were swooping down uninterruptedly on anything that moved. I could see the mushroom clouds of exploding bombs, burning vehicles, and the wounded, who were picked up by retreating transports. The scenes that had to be enacted in the pocket were indescribable, and we could do nothing to help. Man, horse, and truck by the Lord were struck. This saying, from a poem on the battles of the Crusaders in Pagestine in about 1213, had come to my mind twice before, in December 1941 by Moscow and in 1943 in North Africa. The jaws of the pocket had not yet quite closed. Further south, near the little village of Chambois on the river Dives, there was still a gap, as yet unfilled by the Americans and Montgomery's two divisions. This was probably because, on the one hand, we had managed time and again to hold up the Polish tank division, and on the other, because Patton no longer seemed to be interested in exploiting his advantage, but in pushing on fast to the Seine east of Paris. A certain animosity on Patton's part toward Monty helped us after all to rescue sizable elements from the pocket, though without their materiel. Colonel Roch and Major Brandt, commander of the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, were to report later under what adventurous circumstances they had managed to extricate themselves from the encirclement, together with the remnants of some SS Panzer divisions, which forced a breach in the closing pocket, and held open the way to the east. Roch's combat group was able to ford the river Dives by night under heavy artillery fire. Corporal Corfleur, commander of one of the last Panzer IVS of No. 4 Company, has given the following account. On the 19th of August came the order every man for himself. With a 2nd Panzer IV we set out on the way to the east. At the sight of naked, half-burned tank men we promised ourselves that we would not let ourselves be finished off in the pocket. It was a hellish journey. In bypassing the horse-drawn column we skidded so badly that we had to abandon our tanks. We continued on foot. During the night we slipped past the enemy, some of whom looked at us in bewilderment. In the morning we were through and for the moment saved. Lieutenant Holler.